All right, so the theme of this lecture is to introduce you to the integumentary system. So integument and integumentary come from a Latin word, integumentum, which means a covering, and the integumentary system is the covering of the body. It's basically the skin with some extra bits. The integumentary system includes the skin, the fat layer underneath the skin, as well as the organ, what are called the accessory organs to the skin. This is mostly the hair and nails. All the bits of your body that face the outside of your body. As we talked about in a previous video, the integument, the skin, is thought of as a cutaneous membrane. As you see here, cutaneous membrane. It's the largest organ in the body. The skin is an organ, by the way. Remember that organs contain more than one tissue type, and complex organs contain all four tissue types, and the skin is a complex organ. It contains epithelial tissue, your epidermis. It contains connective tissue, bunch of it, but basically your entire dermis is connective tissue. It contains nervous tissue. You have many sensory nerves in your skin, and it contains muscular tissue. Not a whole lot of muscular tissue, but specifically you have smooth muscles that are attached to each of your hairs that we will talk about more later on. By weight, it is your largest organ. It's about 2 square meters, although, it depends on the size of the person. And it's about 16% of your body weight. It varies considerably in thickness. On the thinnest portion is the eyelids, where it's about 0.5 millimeter thick, and thickest, well, it depends on exactly how big your fat layer is, but if we're just talking about your skin, which is the epidermis and dermis and does not count the fat layer, then it's going to be thickest on the heels. We'll talk about why that is in just a moment. It is also an organ and organ system that is renewed pretty constantly. So every year, you can lose 1 kilogram of skin epithelium. It flakes off your body constantly. This is one of those weird types of cells that is constantly being born and constantly dying. So you're always making new skin, and old skin is always dying and flaking off your body. It actually goes into making up the major portion of what we would call dust. Most dust is actually just skin particles, little dead skin cells floating around in the air. The skin has 3 layers that each do very different things. The outer layer, and by outer we mean the most superficial layer, is the epidermis. And as you know, epithelial tissue lines things. Epithelial tissue always faces an empty space or a cavity, and the outside world is an empty space, so the epidermis is primarily epithelial tissue. Underneath the epidermis is a thicker layer called the dermis. And the dermis is primarily connective tissue. There's a few different types of connective tissue that you'll find inside of it, depending upon what part you're looking at, but it's mostly connective tissue. This is the area that gives your skin its strength. epithelial tissue is usually pretty weak, whereas connective tissue is usually very strong because of the connective fibers, particularly collagen. The third layer is sometimes called the subcutaneous or sub-Q layer. It's also called the hypodermis. So remember, the cutaneous membrane is your skin. The skin is technically the epidermis and the dermis. This third layer, the sub-Q layer, is part of the integumentary system, but is not formally considered to be a part of the skin. So it's underneath the cutaneous membrane, hence sub-Q. It's also called the hypodermis. Hypo means underneath, literally underneath the dermis. It is a combination of areolar and adipose connective tissue. It is soft and squishy and primarily protective. It also serves to attach the connective tissue of the dermis to the layers of tissue underneath, primarily the fascia connective tissue that forms the lining of your body's cavities, and also forms the layer that connects to your body's muscles and bones. Here's a picture of the skin, and I'm going to go through this in pretty significant detail. All right, so first, the overview. All right, let's magnify this. You can see that there are 3 layers, and those are the 3 layers that we just talked about. The epidermis here, which is epithelial tissue, and the epidermis actually has many different layers inside of it where the cells are a little bit different. So you can see that these cells in the most bottom layer are kind of cuboidal, and then they become more squamous as you go up. So there's different layers called stratum within the epidermis that we'll talk about in a later lecture. Then we have the dermis, which is typically the thicker layer, and it has 2 regions. So first off, note that this interface between the epidermis and the dermis, it consists of this wavy bit here. So like, you got this wavy area. And of course, you know, anytime you see like a wavy sort of structure or a foldy sort of structure, what does that mean is going on? You're maximizing the surface area. In this case, the reason that you're maximizing the surface area is because this is the point of attachment. And the more surface area you have of attachment between your epidermis and your dermis, then the more tightly your epidermis is going to be attached. You don't want your epidermis to fall off or peel off under pressure. Your skin undergoes a lot of different stresses, and you wouldn't want it to lose contact with the dermis. So increasing that surface area is going to increase the amount of contact surface and make it tougher for the epidermis to peel off. This wavy, bumpy layer here that I just outlined is called the papillary region. A pap is a Latin term for a nipple, and this is actually something that you will see very frequently in biology, is that things are called paps or papillaries or papilla if they look kinda nipply. Don't ask me why. Apparently the people who gave this all this stuff names originally. A lot of them were male. A lot of them were monks. They had nipples on the brain, right? So they thought that these looked like nipples, and so they called this the papillary region. And the connective tissue found in this papillary region is primarily areolar tissue. So it's a loose connective tissue, highly vascularized. Lots of capillaries and blood vessels, and lots of nerve endings flowing through it. Once you get below this area of connection, you get to what's called the reticular region. And if you remember, a reticule is a net. And the reticular region is primarily dense, irregular connective tissue. So you've got thick layers of, let's go here, yeah. So you've got these thick layers of cables going back and forth and crossing each other and going any which way. And they are primarily going to be collagen fibers is the most common, but you have a mix of collagen and elastin fibers. It's the collagen fibers that give your skin the strength. This is how when you grab your skin and you pull it or stretch it, whatever, it doesn't tear. That's the strength of the collagen fibers. But also, you'll note that if you stretch your skin, it rebounds. Your skin has a suppleness to it. At least, if you're relatively young, it does. That is due to the elastin fibers. Elastin fibers can be stretched and they spring back without damage. So they prevent the dermis from tearing when it's been overstretched. And you can tell when you've stretched skin too much and you've actually torn the collagen fibers, because you'll end up with stretch marks. Stretch marks are scar tissue that's laid down when you've stretched skin too far and torn the fibers. As you age, those elastin fibers become damaged and your skin has less elastic recoil, less ability and less suppleness to return to its previous shape, and you end up getting wrinkles. That's one of the major causes of wrinkles, is an excess of, or a loss of elastin fibers in the skin. Going further down here, past the dermis, you see the subcutaneous layer down here. Now the dermis is dense, irregular connective tissue, so it doesn't actually have very many open spaces. You have arteries and veins and nerves that go through it, but they don't branch very much. They go through holes that have been made for it, but they don't spread out. And same with these glands here, which we'll talk about later on. So we would say that it is not, the reticular region is not very highly vascularized. You have larger blood vessels and nerves moving through, and they don't usually branch until they either get to their destination or until they get up into the areolar tissue of the papillary region. Subcutaneous layer is different. Remember that fat is a loose connective tissue. Adipose tissue is a loose connective tissue. So is areolar tissue, and that's what's making up this area here. And so this is very highly vascularized. Lots and lots of blood vessels in there. So if you have a cut, an injury that goes down all the way to the subcutaneous layer, it will usually bleed profusely. Whereas a cut that only goes into the dermal layer will bleed significantly less. All right, let's take an overview of the sorts of things that you're going to find here. First off, you can see, remember we talked about this papillary region. So here you can see an area where the epidermis has been pulled away, and you can see that what are called the dermal papilla. Those are those little nipply structures in there. And the epidermal ridges, that's the opposite. That's a little nipply structure going down, is called a ridge. And in some types of skin, these are going to be much deeper than others, right? So in your feet, your plantar surface of your feet and the palmar surface of your hands, you have very, very thick epidermal ridges, and those actually are what lay out the patterns that go into making your finger and footprints. Here in the papillary layer, you can see lots of vascularized area. So lots of capillaries in there. And that's important because the epidermis has no vascularization. So all of the nutrients that are going to feed it have to diffuse in from the papillary layer of the dermis. You have several different types of nerve endings in here, and we will have a video that deals exclusively with the nerves, the sensory nerves of the skin. But to give you that in brief, you have some nerves that wrap around hairs. These are what are called free nerve endings, and they wrap around hairs, so they are going to be follicle-related hair endings. You have free nerve endings that go up and into the dermal papilla, and these are usually going to be associated with, like, often with pain or heat. You have these encapsulated nerve endings called corpuscles, and these are called corpuscles of touch or Meissner corpuscles. These are found in very high density on your fingertips and are responsible for the ability of your fingertips to be the most touch discerning surface, or one of the most touch discerning surfaces of your body. You have way deep down here at the interface between the hypodermis and the lower portions of the dermis, you have these large lamellated or Pacinian corpuscles. Those are also nerve endings, and they actually detect pressure, and specifically changes in pressure. This structure here is a hair, and you can see that the portion above the hair is called the shaft, and the portion below the skin is called the root. And down here at the bottom is a bulb called the hair follicle, and inside, if we magnify out here, this hair is actually made out of epidermal tissue, right? So this is epithelial tissue. That's epithelial tissue. That's epithelial tissue. It's modified from the same types of cells called keratinocytes that make up the upper layers of your skin. They actually are what's going to generate the hair in here. But right here, let's go ahead and outline this. Right in here, you see there's this little bit of dermal tissue that pokes in. This area that's right around it, this is where the living cells are. Most of the cells in the hair follicle and in the hair shaft are dead, but this is where the living cells are, and they reproduce right here, and you have capillaries that come up into this little region here, and they give nutrients and oxygen to these living cells that then reproduce and die and become part of the hair as they go outwards. And remember, mostly monks, mostly guys, nipples on the brain. This is called the papilla of the hair because they thought it looked like a nipple. All right. You have several types of glands, and we're also going to have a video associated just with glands, but I want to show you where they're located in the context of the skin. You basically have 3 types of skin glands that you're going to find usually in skin. There are eccrine skin glands, and they look like these long, convoluted tubules. They produce normal sweat on your body, and they end in pores. You will find these all over your body, and they produce normal sweat. Interestingly, the sweat that they produce generally does not stink. It's just salt water, and it's intended to cool you. You also have these apocrine sweat glands. They look pretty similar to the eccrine sweat glands. The cells and the tubules that make them up are actually a bit larger, but they still look like this convoluted tubule. But you'll note that the tube that comes up, instead of just ending at a pore, it joins in to a hair shaft. And specifically, it joins into a particular type of hair shaft, and that is hair that is produced on special parts of the body. The parts of the body that start growing hair in puberty. So, the genitals, the armpits, the beard, facial region in men, and to a certain extent, the scalp in almost everyone. And these, while they do serve the function of cooling you, the sweat that they produce has a lot of proteins in it. Those proteins by themselves don't stink, but the bacteria on the surface of your skin eat the proteins, and the byproducts that they leave behind are what is responsible for BO. So most sweat actually does not produce BO. It's only the sweat that comes from these apocrine sweat glands. And it's thought that this is some sort of pheromone signal of sexual maturity. I don't find it particularly sexy, but that's the idea, is that it signals sexual availability. And it's been shown that, for instance, males with higher testosterone level will produce more of it, and women will produce more of this type of sweat when they're near ovulation. So it gives off certain signals that I guess are detectable and signify sexual aspects. You also have these glands here. They're also associated with hairs, but they're associated with all hairs, not just puberty hairs. And they are called sebaceous glands or oil glands. These produce sebum, which is the oily fluid that coats your skin and is responsible for making your skin waterproof. Hairs are connected to this smooth muscle here called the erector pili muscle, or the piloerector muscle. Both terms are used sometimes. And if you've ever had like goosebumps and your hair stands on end, that is the action of the erector pili muscle. When it contracts, it causes your hair to stand up. In hairier animals than us, this is a cold response that basically makes it so that you're better insulated. Your hair holds in warmth better. In many animals, especially primates, it also is activated basically when you get excited, when you produce adrenaline, and it causes your hair to stand on end, which makes you look bigger. It's an intimidation factor. It's particularly something that male primates do. Humans have mostly vestigial hair, and it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of effect on us. But it does seem to play still some roles that we don't entirely understand. Taking a closer look at the epidermis, there are several different types of cells that you'll see here. Here on the bottom layer, most of the cells here are what we call keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are epithelial cells, and they start off as cuboidal epithelial cells, and they produce a tough protein called keratin. Keratin is the protein that makes your nails and your hair hard. There's a different variant of keratin that is produced in your skin cells. It's slightly softer, but it still gives strength to your skin. In this bottom layer, there are special stem cells. These divide, and when they divide, they fill up patches left from your keratinocytes moving up, which they do. All of your keratinocytes are born in this bottom layer, and then they move upwards through time. As they move upwards, we'll talk about exactly what happens to them in a later video, but as they move upwards, they flatten out, and they start producing more and more and more keratin until eventually they die. And then when they die because they filled up with so much keratin that they can't actually live anymore. And then they become this dead layer called the stratum corneum, which is a layer of dead keratinized cells on the top layer of your epidermis. That's most of the cells in your epidermis, but you have a few other ones as well. There are what are called dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are immune system cells. And as you see here, it puts off all of these arms, these little tentacles. So it's a stellate cell. And these are like your body's border guards, right? Anything trying to come in through the skin, like a virus or a bacteria or some sort of infectious particle, will need to pass by one or more dendritic cells. And the dendritic cells can detect them and then eat them. They're phagocytic, and when they eat them, they send off a signal that says, hey, I just ate an intruder. That means we've got intruders, and it starts mobilizing the immune system. We'll talk about this more when we talk about the immune system. So these are immune system protective cells. We also have melanocytes. They're found in the lowest layer, and they also put out a bunch of projections, but in their case, they're not protecting you from bacteria, they're protecting you from the sun. These melanocytes produce a dark pigment called melanin. This is the pigment that is primarily responsible for your skin color. And they grow these long tentacles, and then they deposit melanin in nearby cells. So it isn't just the melanocyte that has the melanin. The melanocyte basically gives melanin to a bunch of nearby cells, and then as those cells move up through the layers, their color becomes more readily apparent. Some people have more melanocytes. Some people have fewer melanocytes. This is part of the genetics of skin color, but there are many things that affect skin color that we'll talk about in a future lecture. Last cell in the epidermis that I want to talk about is this here. It's called a tactile cell or a Merkel cell. It's found in the bottom layer of the epidermis, and it rests right next to this this nerve cell here, which is called a Merkel disc or a tactile disc. And basically what this cell does is it senses touch and vibration, very, very light touch in the epidermis. And if it gets deformed at all because your epidermis is being put under pressure or something like that, it will stimulate the nerve underneath it, and that gives you a touch sensation. There are two general types of epidermis that you will find on a standard human. There's what is called thin skin or hairy skin, and there's what's called thick skin or hairless skin. There are some differences between them. Thin skin is the most common. It covers all of the regions of your body that have hair growing out of them. Hence, it's also called hairy skin. Doesn't have to be a lot of hair. This is most of your body. This is all the skin on your arms, all the skin on your legs, all the skin on your torso and your back. If you're male, you probably have a lot of hair there. If you're female, you might have very thin, short hairs there, but you still have some hair there. Most of the skin on your face and scalp, the backs of your hands and the backs of your feet, that's all hairy skin. Thick skin, hairless skin, covers the surfaces of your palms, your palmar surface, and your soles of your feet, your plantar surface. And this is a special primate adaptation, right? These are your grasping surfaces, right? Hands are what you use to grab hold of things, whether they are tools or branches and you're swinging through the trees. A lot of primates use their feet just as much as they do their hands when they're climbing through the trees. So these areas take a lot more abuse, right? You think of, holding a hammer or a baseball bat or swinging from the monkey bars or whatever, right? Those surfaces, the surface of your palms and your feet, just simply take a lot more shearing stress than most of the rest of your body. So they're built a bit differently. First off, they don't have hair. There are good reasons for that. Hair, if you'll recall, sebaceous glands, oil glands, are connected to hair follicles, and you do not want oil coating the surface of your hands. Most of your body is coated with oil, and that makes it more waterproof. But you don't want your hands to be coated with oil or your feet to be coated with oil because you use them to grab onto things. And you don't want it to slip out of your hands because it's got oil all over it, right? So, no oil, no hair. Second, you have a much thicker papillary region with very high dermal papules and very deep epidermal ridges. This creates even more contact surface because the surfaces of your hands are going to undergo a lot of stress. So you need to have more contact surface to make sure that your skin doesn't strip off under that stress. Third, in that much deeper papillary region, you have those special corpuscles of touch, or Meissner corpuscles. These can be found in any type of skin, but they are particularly dense in thick skin. This is what gives your fingertips such a fine touch discernment. Right? So this is why you can read Braille with your fingertips. You can't read Braille with, your elbow. Because you have a much higher density of these corpuscles of touch in your fingertips, where you have these dermal or epidermal ridges and dermal papilla. Fourth, having these dermal ridges is what is responsible for the pattern of your fingerprints and footprints, right? If you look at the surface of like the back of your hands or your arm or something like that, you don't really have prints there. Not in the same way that you do on your palm and your fingers and your feet. Those are called friction ridges, and they increase the surface area of your hand. And the reason why they do that is that's your grip surface. Right? If you've ever had like work gloves that have those like rubber dots on them to increase your grip, same idea. These ridges increase the surface area of contact between your hand or your feet and whatever it is that you're grabbing hold of or stepping on, and give you better grip. Last, your next to last, your thick skin has an extra layer of epidermis in it, called the stratum lucidum. We'll talk about that in a later video, but that extra layer contributes to the thickness and also does a few interesting things to the skin. You've got that extra stratum lucidum right there. And last, the stratum corneum. This is the layer of dead skin that is the uppermost, the most superficial layer of your epidermis. And here you can see in thin skin, right? So you just have a few layers of epidermis here in your stratum corneum, just a few layers of dead skin. Here in your thick skin, you have tens to hundreds of layers of dead skin. This again protects you, right? So your thick skin is literally protective because your feet and your hands take a lot more stress than any other part of your body. You'll note that they don't bruise as easy. If you give somebody like a rug burn or an Indian burn, right? Theoretically, their arm is taking the same stress as your hands that are doing the rubbing on it. Yet it's going to hurt their arm a lot more than it hurts your hands because you have this thick layer of dead skin cells on it. They actually build up over time. They can become calluses. This is why you tend to get calluses on your palms and on your feet, and you don't usually get calluses on, like, your forearm. The dermis, connective tissue layer beneath the epidermis. It ranges from 0.2 millimeters in the eyelids to 4 millimeters in the palms and soles. It can actually be even thicker than that if you have thick calluses in your palms and soles. It is primarily, remember that papillary layer is areolar tissue, and the reticular layer is dense, irregular connective tissue. Both of those are mainly collagen in the extracellular matrix. There are many blood vessels, sweat glands, sebaceous glands, and nerve endings inside of it. There aren't any nerve endings technically in the epidermis, but there are lots of them in the dermis. That's where all of them are. Some of them are high up in the dermis, like the Meissner corpuscles that are in the papillary layer. Some of them are really deep into the dermis, like the lamellated corpuscles, which sends pressure. And you have a whole bunch of nerve endings in and between. This is the layer that your hair follicles are embedded in, that your nail roots are embedded in as well. Most muscles of your body attach to bones. But some muscles of your body, particularly in your face, attach to your skin. And these are your muscles of facial expression. If you think about, you can like raise and lower your eyebrows. You can smile. You can frown. You can pout. All of that is because you've got muscles that attach to your skin's surface, and specifically they attach to the dermis, and that's what they're moving around. And we talked about the dermal papilla and the epidermal ridges and the friction ridges of fingerprints. All of that is a interface between the epidermis and the dermis. The hypodermis, subcutaneous tissue. It's areolar and adipose tissue. It is highly vascularized. You have lots of blood vessels flowing through it. You have lots of nerves moving through it, but few nerve endings in it. And it has a few functions. First, padding, right? So it is where your subcutaneous fat is, so that when you bang, your arm on something, it gets cushioned and it doesn't bruise the bone. There are some parts of your body that don't have much of a hypodermis. So if you think of your shins, you feel your shins and it's basically, you can feel it, it's just skin, and you can feel the bone very, very easily. You can feel other parts of your body where you have much thicker hypodermal fat layers, and if you bang your shins, it's going to hurt a lot more than if you bang, your belly on something. So it's protective in that sense. It's also protective in the sense that it is thermal protection. Fat is a great thermal insulator, and the hypodermis helps hold heat in. It is very highly vascularized, and so it's a common site of drug injection. You might have heard of subcutaneous injections. That is an injection into the subcutaneous fat layer. There's so many blood vessels and capillaries around that area that drugs are taken up very quickly. They get into the blood very quickly from that area. The subcutaneous fat is an insulation, a heat insulation. It's also an energy reservoir. It tends to be thicker in women than men. Women tend to distribute their fat across their entire body. Men tend to keep their fat around their gut. We don't know exactly why this is, but it's definitely influenced by testosterone levels. The male androgen hormones influence where fat is kept in the body, and it distributes differently in many women than in men. In infants, it tends to be fairly small because infants use up energy at a ferocious rate, so they haven't had time to build up those fat reserves yet. And in the elderly as well, it tends to break down and be much less thick. This is one reason why the elderly have such fragile skin. So we've talked about the structure of the skin and the cutaneous membrane. Let's talk about its general functions. And these are all going to be related to those structures that we talked about. First off, protection, right? Resistance to trauma, trauma's injury, and infection. There are many different ways that it does this. Keratin, which is that tough protein in your keratinocytes of your epidermis. It's a very strong protein. It's the same protein that makes up your hair and nails. And it prevents your skin from being abraded. Your sweat contains salt, which inhibits bacterial growth. And it also contains dermicidin and defensins. These are proteins that kill dangerous bacteria. And your oil, remember we said that your sebaceous glands produce oil. It's actually an acidic oil, and that acid also helps to reduce the growth of bacteria. In addition to protecting you from injury and infection, it also acts as a barrier, right? A water barrier. It stops water from getting into your skin, but more importantly, it stops water from leaking out of your skin. This is vitally important if you're going to live on land. You can't leak water all the time or you'll die of dehydration super fast. So the water barrier function is mostly to keep your body's water inside of your body, but it's also very important in preventing infection. Most infectious particles move through water. That's how they get from point A to point B, is they float there. So if you have a waterproof barrier, it prevents infectious particles from getting into your body through your skin. It protects you from UV radiation. UV radiation can be very damaging to DNA, and the melanin pigment that is produced by melanocytes absorbs UV radiation. The more radiation you absorb with melanin, the less harm that it does to the cells around you. It also protects you from many harmful chemicals. There's a few ways that it does this. One is by being waterproof. Most of these chemicals are water soluble. If you have a waterproof barrier in your skin, they can't get inside because the skin is waterproof. It also protects you simply by virtue of the fact that you've got dead skin on your surface, right? So let's say you get some caustic chemical on you that damages tissue. Well, what's the first thing it's going to hit? Dead skin. Does the dead skin care? No, it's already dead. What's it going to do? It can't kill it any more than it already is. So it gives you a certain amount of time to get that caustic chemical off of your skin before it eats through that dead skin layer. Vitamin D synthesis. We'll talk about this more later on, but your skin carries out the first step of vitamin D synthesis. It is made in the cells of your epidermis. It's actually made by two things. First is UV radiation, right? The original vitamin D is made from a cholesterol derivative, and it takes UV radiation hitting it to cause the first step of the reaction. And the second step is actually caused by warming. So both of these are caused by sunlight. UV radiation comes in on the sunlight and carries out the first step, and then the warming action of the sun on your skin carries out the second step. This proto-vitamin D is then carried to the liver and the kidneys to complete the process, and we will talk more about that when we talk about bones. This first step is absolutely vital. And you'll note it's contrary to this here. The more melanin you have, the more UV radiation you block. It's possible to have so much melanin in your skin that you block all of the access to vitamin D synthesis. So people with extremely dark skin can be prone to vitamin D deficiencies. We'll talk about that more later on. Sensation. Your skin is chock full of sensory organs, right? The sense of touch isn't actually a very well-defined sense. It means a lot of different things, but most of what we would call touch receptors are in your skin. And we will have an extensive video that just looks at these receptors. But you've got receptors for temperature, touch, pain, much more than that. Itch, tickle, irritation, all sorts of things. Thermoregulation. All right, so we know about this. When you're hot, you sweat from your sweat glands. That evaporation of that water cools you down. In addition, your skin is a major blood reservoir. It can hold up to 1/3 of your body's blood at any one time if you're shunting a lot of blood to it. So if you're very hot, you're going to be shunting more blood to your skin, and the sweat will then carry heat away from that blood, because blood is what carries heat around your body. If you're cold, you will shunt blood away from your skin and towards your body's core to preserve that heat. So your skin, through both blood restriction and perspiration, is one of your body's major regulators of temperature. And last, and this is particularly true in primates, is nonverbal communication. There is a ton of information that you can get from somebody based off of just their skin, particularly their face. Facial expressions are muscle manipulations of the skin, and they convey a lot of information. Enough so that somebody who is, for instance, paralyzed in their facial muscles, which can happen due to stroke, or Botox injections gone wrong or something like that, even though they may have a full range of expression or of emotions still, the fact that they cannot convey those emotions through facial expression can put people really off on them. It makes it harder to socially communicate with them. They have a full range of language. They can still tell you if they're happy, sad, irritated, whatever, but a ton of the information that your brain integrates into deciding how to interpret a social situation comes from reading facial expressions. From like the girl who comes home and, her grandmother looks at her face and can tell without any words being exchanged that, something's wrong. She's got a problem with her boyfriend, and knows to then go talk to her about that just by looking at her face, at her body language. These are very important symbols of social communication. There's actually a ton of communication that happens in non-human primates, and most of it happens by facial expression. Vocalizations are much less important. They can't talk, but they can still sure communicate using their face. All right, to reiterate, for this section, I want to make sure that you understand the structure of the skin, the three layers, epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis, and what their basic composition is in terms of tissue. You need to know the components of each, and we'll get into more detail on the layers of the epidermis. You need to know what you'll find in the dermis, what type of tissue where, the function of the papillary layer and epidermal ridges. We'll talk more about the structure of hair and nails in future videos. You need to know the functions of the skin and what part of the skin is responsible for each of those functions. So let's say that I was to tell you that person X has no melanocytes. What skin function is going to be impaired? Person Y has no sebaceous glands. What skin functions are going to be impaired? That sort of thing. So you should be able to relate the structures that we found in the skin to these functions discussed here. You need to know the differences between thick skin and thin skin and why those differences are adaptive, what purpose they serve. All right, so that is an overview of the integumentary system. We're going to delve in, do a deep dive on some specific topics, but that's, about 70% of the basic information right there. All right, have a good day.